This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, Marco Rubio angers some within his own party by backing the immigration reform bill. The chatter increases about a possible run by Bill Nelson for governor. There are dueling Medicaid ads running on television, while it looks like a major expansion of Medicaid is in trouble in this session. And election changes have a good shot at passage in Tallahassee, but the Democrats are not on board. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorai.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Dr. Darrell Paulson is Professor Emeritus of Government at USF St. Petersburg. William March is Senior Political Writer for the Tampa Tribune. Barry Edwards is a Democratic strategist and a political strategist and a Democrat, rather. And Chris Ingram is a political analyst for Bay News 9 and a contributing columnist for the Tampa Tribune. Thanks for coming. Great to see you. Well, the most sweeping immigration reform bill in the last 26 years was unveiled this week in Washington, designed to remake the U.S. immigration system. And Florida Senator Marco Rubio is a member of the bipartisan Gang of Eight, which developed the bill. He made the rounds this week on the national talk shows.
I think it's important to understand it doesn't give anything. It allows people access to the legal immigration system. Number two, some people won't qualify. They haven't been here long enough. They've committed very serious crimes. They won't be able to stay. Number three is all people will get is the opportunity to apply for things, to apply for a legal status, which isn't awarded on day one. I mean, there's a process for that.
The immigration reform plan includes a pathway to citizenship for about 11 million undocumented people currently living in the U.S. This involves a 10-year process in order to get a green card and full citizenship 3 years after that. Applicants must pay a fine and back taxes, plus learn English and pass a background check. The bill allocates $5 billion over 10 years, with $3 billion for increasing border security.
That means securing the border, universal E-Verify, and a universal entry-exit tracking system. If those three things are not in place, that green card process won't begin, even if the 10 years has elapsed.
Still, not all Congress members are on board with it.
No, I'm not convinced. I know Senator Rubio's heart is exactly right, and I really respect the work of the Gang of Eight. But they have produced a legislation, it appears, that will give amnesty now, legalize everyone that's here effectively today, and then there's a promise of enforcement in the future.
These are compatible ideas. Enhancing border security, allowing for a clear path to citizenship that requires a number of very specific steps. So the President is very pleased with the progress we've seen thus far.
Members of the Tea Party protested what they called the amnesty plan at Senator Rubio's South Florida office this week, saying that they disagreed with opening that door to people currently considered undocumented aliens. So, Chris, is Marco Rubio out on a limb by being part of this Gang of Eight?
I think he is. I think he's finding that he stepped in something that is kind of messy, that stinks, and he can't get out of it now. This is a bill that I think is necessary. I mean, we've got to do something with all these people that are here. You can call it whatever you want, amnesty or what have you, but look, we've got to do something with 11 million people. It's completely impractical to do what I think most of the Tea Party folks want to do, which is round all these people up and send them back to their country of origin, which is just a preposterous notion that could not be done.
This week, Rush Limbaugh gave Marco Rubio a hard time on his radio show, saying, look, why do we have to even deal with the issue of immigration? We'll just vote no on it.
Well,
that's what
you know, I think Rush lives in a completely different world of reality, and as long as he has his OxyContin and his Viagra prescriptions that he obtained illegally, he's happy. But look, the fact of the matter is we do have a problem that needs to be addressed. So kudos to Marco Rubio and the others that are working on this. But this is a terrible piece of legislation, I think, from the standpoint of, you know, it's such a long-term path, this notion of, you know, having to have these people pay, and they're going to have to wait even further to actually get their citizenship. The requirement that they learn English is certainly a great idea, but in practice, is that something that is going to be realistic to accomplish? And also, I would point out a little bit of the hypocrisy in Marco Rubio as the spokesperson that the Republican Party has anointed for his appeal to Hispanics, that these provisions in this bill don't provide anything, they don't apply, rather, to Marco Rubio's Hispanic origin,
You
and
mean
that
the
being
Cuban,
Cuban, and they're
immigrants?
exempt from all of this stuff because of the wet foot, dry foot policy. So no Cuban that comes to this country is going to have to go through all this nonsense, because once they get here, they're carte blanche, basically accepted and on their way. And so I think Marco's going to have to deal with that, as well as the media begins to explore this and recognizing the difference in the Hispanic communities from one coast to the other.
And Daryl, let me ask you about the politics of this. Is Marco Rubio in trouble? Because it's often said that he is going to be one of the front runners for the Republican nomination in 2016 for president. By taking this stance, is he alienating the Republican base?
Yes, he's getting a lot of conservative blowback, but once again, if he's running for president, he's also making himself very popular with the independents and moderates. That will be very important for a presidential campaign. People are looking for problem solvers, and what Rubio's trying to do is solve a problem. The issue here is one word, and that's amnesty. And a lot of people are stuck on that word. Is it or is it not?
And does the Republican base view it as amnesty?
Absolutely, they do, and in fact, PolitiFact, looked at this. Is it or is it not amnesty? And they said, in fact, Rubio said this is not amnesty because you have this 10-year drawn-out process. They have to pay fines, et cetera. But they said it was a half-truth because under the current law, people who come here without following the procedures have to go back to their home country. And so they said it's half-true. So if you want to, whatever you want to call it, obviously it's a violation of the current procedure. But it's somewhat strange, the AP has taken that word illegal amnesty out of its lexicon.
Illegal aliens out.
Yeah, you can't call them illegal aliens any longer, illegal immigrants. So, it's one of those things, what's in a word?
Rob, I would just point out, though, that I think, we have this great goal, but it's kind of like having a goal you want to tame a lion. My grandfather used to joke to me, you could tame a lion if you put a ribeye steak on his forehead. Okay, great, but how do you get close enough to the lion with the steak in his hand to put it in your hand to put it on his forehead? You can't do it. And what we're trying to do here, it's almost unachievable. The burdens and the length of time and the amount of money and things like that. And then you look at the border provisions that supposedly have to be occurring in order for this bill to keep moving forward. And once it's passed, I just think that we've set ourselves up for failure.
Barry?
I respectfully disagree. I think this is not amnesty. There's a clear, long pathway.
I didn't say it was amnesty.
To citizenship. And citizenship is a precious right, our most precious right. And so there should be something hard about becoming a citizen. And a lot of these people have gotten here a lot easier than our ancestors that happened to go across a 3,000-mile ocean. But however they got here, there has to be some price to citizenship. Two, we can't kick them out. That's not practical. Even the Chamber of Commerce says that they need these people for our industry. So it can be a utopian view that we can just kick them out and go about our life. Our economy would collapse. We need them. And also, they're part of our fabric of life. But I think what's interesting is both Marco Rubio and Rick Scott have moved toward the center on this because they realize they live in a state that's a centrist state and that is not a conservative ideological state. And so they need to be appealing to these people if they're going to be reelected.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, you were just saying that this legislation is quite complicated, and you weren't saying it was amnesty.
No, I was not. I don't think it is amnesty, and I think that the ultimate goal of we need to integrate these people into our society is practical, realistic, and needs to be done.
Yeah, and there's some common ground there between you and Barry.
So, yeah.
Wendy, what about the politics of this? Let's go back to that question. Marco Rubio, is he threatening his political future by taking the stance that we want to have by supporting immigration reform?
He's taken a risk, but I think it was a risk that he could not avoid because he would have been pushed to the forefront on this issue if he hadn't voluntarily stepped to the forefront. The right-wing bloggers, not very few establishment Republicans, but the right-wing bloggers, the Tea Party types, the ones who don't really have a commitment to the established Republican Party, are coming after him hammer and tongs. Now he's doing, I think, a real good job of fighting back. I've gotten 5 different myth versus fact press releases from his office today. Mm-hmm. This afternoon, he was, we're taping this on Thursday, and as of this afternoon, he was going to visit the Radio Row of conservative radio talk show hosts gathered at a conservative anti-illegal immigration advocacy group meeting in Washington.
So he's going right in the heart of the battle.
He is jumping right into, he's attacking the enemy frontally, the enemy being conservatives who oppose him on this, and he's cracked them a little bit. Hannity backs him, O'Reilly backs him, Charles Krauthammer backs him. Some of the others, like Laura Ingraham, may not back him, but they're taking a moderate tone on it. So I think he's done a pretty good job, and you got to keep in mind that this is a guy who has spent his entire career threading this kind of needle on issues like official English, on the tough anti-immigration bills that came up when he was Speaker of the House. He's carefully threaded the needle between the conservative base and his own Hispanic ethnicity.
Okay. Well, will Bill Nelson trade in his Senate seat for the governor's mansion? He says he's considering it, but what would his candidacy mean for the 2014 governor's race? The Tampa Bay Times reports their latest Florida Insider poll of veteran political experts shows 2/3 believe Senator Nelson would be a stronger candidate against Governor Scott than Charlie Crist. 8 in 10 of them predict that Nelson would beat Crist in the Democratic primary as well. 63% of those surveyed said Nelson would be the strongest Democratic candidate, while 31% backed Charlie Crist and 5% backed Alex Sink. While none of these possible Democratic challengers has officially announced yet, Governor Scott has already begun fundraising for his re-election campaign. Wendy, you've talked to Senator Nelson. I said that he was considering it. Is he actually that strong, or is he just what's his take?
He's not quite considering it. In fact, well, he's not quite saying it. In fact, he's not personally talking about it at all. What he has done is he has put the word out through anonymous close friends and advisors and supporters that he's not rejecting it. And it's and I think that's part of a strategy on his part. Nelson, to me, I believe, has a strong desire to see Rick Scott unseated. And I think what he's going to do is he's just going to sit and wait and watch and see how the race shapes up, which Democrats appear to be heading for toward getting the nomination, and whether there's a Democrat in that group that can beat Scott.
So he would hold his fire and then jump in.
And hold his fire and jump in if he starts to get worried about Scott winning.
Barry, do you think that the talk about Nelson possibly running is serious? I mean, you're an active activist within the party.
I think it's serious for a lot of people. I think the most important thing to look at is if Bill Nelson runs, if Charlie Crist runs, if Alex Sink runs, they're going to beat Rick Scott. They're going to trounce Rick Scott because he's the most unpopular governor.
What if they all three run against each other?
I think that they're all friends or friendly, and that you won't see a interceding primary against them. And I think one thing on Bill Nelson, he spent 12 years in the Senate building up a power base to have a huge amount of influence. Jay Rockefeller from West Virginia is retiring after decades in the U.S. Senate. He will be the chairman of the Commerce Committee. One of the most important projects that Bill Nelson has fought for his entire career is NASA. NASA is regulated by the Commerce Committee. So he's giving up a lot of influence, a lot of power to go back and run a state where there's other people that could unseat Rick Scott.
A couple of things that shouldn't be lost on viewers is, one, Bill Nelson wants the job. He ran for it before he was a United States Senator. Democrats in this state have a history of bouncing back and forth from governor to Senate or Senate to governor, as the case in Bob Grant and Lawton Chiles, so there's certainly a precedent there for Bill Nelson. But more big picture, the problem here is the Democrats, one, they have no bench, okay? And number two, the fact that we're talking about Bill Nelson going up against Rick Scott, indicative of no bench, no one else could risk the political capital and raise the amount of money to go into the lion's den with Rick Scott and probably end up losing with all the money that he will spend. Charlie Crist, as I wrote in my column in the Tribune a couple of weeks ago, I think is going to be the best thing that could possibly happen for Rick Scott at this point. Even though the polls say that he beats Scott, I think once Scott starts to unleash some of that money and attack Crist and all of his flip-flops, he'll be able to do what Rick Scott can't do for himself, namely get Republican voters excited about Rick Scott because they want to beat Charlie Crist for him being a turncoat.
Darrell, last word on that.
I'm not sure that all three of the Democrats we've named could beat Rick Scott. Charlie Crist, I think, would have the most difficult time for a couple of reasons. One is that you've got a good opportunity for a side-by-side comparison. That you look at Crist's tenure as governor, and during that tenure, Florida lost 800,000 jobs. Governor Scott can point out during his tenure, we've regained 300,000 jobs. Governor Scott has reduced corporate income taxes. The unemployment rate has dropped from 11% to about 8% in the state, the second highest drop in the country. So he can make some good side-by-side comparisons. And so I think Crist has all sorts of other baggage. The fact that he's run for governor as a Republican, then he ran as an independent, then he would be running as a Democrat. This whole image of what's Charlie today, what's he going to be tomorrow. Would be a great opportunity for Scott, especially with a $100 million bankroll.
Barry, I know you want to jump in, but we've got to move to our next topic. With time running out in the legislative session, the House and Senate have different approaches to providing insurance for low-income Floridians, and both sides have taken their messages to the airwaves.
Is Medicaid expansion really such a good deal for Florida? Washington promises to pay the billions in new costs, but with these endless federal deficits, can we really trust them? If Florida gets stuck with the long-term bill, it'll bust our state budget. That could force big cuts in funding for education. Sign our no thanks petition to Tallahassee at floridacandobetter.com. Protect our budget and schools.
Typical politics. House Speaker Will Weatherford is putting politics ahead of working families. The Florida House is trying to block federal tax money that should go to expand health coverage for hardworking families in Florida. Instead, letting it go to other states. Working parents go without health insurance. Florida taxpayers lose $51 billion. And Will Weatherford just plays politics. Tell him to stop the politics and expand Medicaid to 1 million hardworking Floridians.
The House has voted to reject federal funding for the expansion of Medicaid, but they've developed an alternative plan using state money.
We want to change the healthcare system and provide all people, not create a two-tier system of healthcare, one for the rich people and one for the poor people. Our system is going to get everybody ultimately with a quality healthcare system.
House Democrats say it doesn't cover enough people.
If we can sit here and actually not even consider this, not consider the fact that we've got studies that show that lives will be saved if we took advantage of this money.
Politics should not have anything to do with this. The fact is, $55 billion of our tax money going some other place. As I said, Lord Childs would say, that dog don't hunt.
Meantime, a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee this week voted to send two very different plans to the House in an effort to reach some agreement.
I'm going to ask you to vote yes on both of them today, because you know what it does? It keeps our options open. The one thing that we don't want to do is move into the final 3 weeks of our of session without having something on the table.
Senator Bean authored a proposal that would use only state dollars, like the House plan, and would cover fewer people than the other Senate-approved plan written by Senator Joe Negron. Negron's plan would use $55 billion in federal money over 10 years to help about 1 million Floridians buy private health insurance.
This is not a case where we have, we care about the patients and want to do right by people, and the House doesn't, and none of you have said that, but that's not what it is. This is about two good faith efforts to achieve the same goal, for people to have insurance.
We need to address the needs of the people of the state of Florida. We need to address the moral issue that we are confronted with and do the right thing.
Some senators argued that by sending two plans to the House, they were sending mixed messages. So, Barry, it seems it boils down to whether or not Florida is going to reject some $50 to $55 billion in federal money on principle, or do we accept it because it's going to help the state? What's your take?
Well, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy here. First of all, there's all these arguments that we shouldn't take federal money because of the deficit and things that we can't control. What we can't control is Floridians pay tax dollars out now, and they go to the federal government, and they come back or they go to someplace else. And there are dollars. We're a donor state. We need to take them back. But the fact that we don't want to take federal dollars, $26.5 billion of the Florida budget this year are federal dollars that they paid back in. That's 35.6% of the state budget, which is roughly equal to the general revenue fund. So we're taking federal dollars. So the argument that we shouldn't take federal money because of deficits and things like that are specious at best, dishonest at worst. Two, we have 1 million people that need to be covered. If they're not covered by this, they're going to go to emergency rooms and not be paid for, so we're going to subsidize it. The kids are going to get sick, they're going to get our children sick, and the rest of society sick. So we need to do these things not out of altruism, but out of our self-interest. And finally, yesterday they had they spend 10 to 15 minutes on the floor talking about a wildflower license plate bill, but we can't spend time debating what is going to be the only issue that history will look back at in this legislature, whether we take the Medicaid and how we do it.
Chris, what's your take? Should we take the federal Medicaid dollars?
I don't think so, and I take exception to Barry's comments about the fact that, you know, just because it's there and other people or other states are going to get it, if we don't, we're a donor state. I mean, that type of thinking is what got us into this problem in the first place in terms of the federal debt and the deficit. At what point do we say, okay, now let's stop the insanity just because that's the way we've been doing it? When do we stop? Look, the House proposal, I think, is a good one. It's self-sufficient. It promotes personal responsibility, efficiency, and choice. And those are things that we need without having to rely upon the federal government, which is basically on the verge of bankruptcy, if you really consider it. And we're counting on the federal government with this other program that's been rejected at this point. They might not be there to have the money to fund this program if it were passed the way it was presently presented, and we shouldn't rely on it that way. This is a responsible, fiscally conservative thing to do.
Okay. Well, changes to the state's election laws that could help keep Florida out of the negative national spotlight next time around have a good chance of passing this year in Tallahassee, but without Democratic support. In an effort to combat the long lines that voters faced in the last election, both the House and Senate have proposed expanding early voting from 1 week. Elections officials would have the discretion to hold between 8 and 14 days of early voting, and they could decide whether to allow voting on the Sunday before an election. They could also use more public places like convention centers and libraries for early voting, but Democrats say the proposed changes don't go far enough.
You're not going to get a bipartisan bill, and then they'll have to deal with the ramifications of 2014, and that's, again, being laughingstock of the nation.
Darrell, what do you think? The Democrats say it's in the right direction, but doesn't go far enough. They're not on board.
Florida's always had a problem. The 2000 election pointed out the problem. We changed things in Florida after that. We got new election machinery. We changed the Florida election laws. Things were going along fairly well after that. Then all of a sudden in 2011, the Florida legislature changed the laws again. 2012, we had these massive backups. In the 2012 election, the last voter cast a ballot at 2:54 in the morning, almost 8 hours after the polls closed. An Ohio State University study pointed out that 200,000 Floridians didn't vote in 2012 because of the long lines, that if all of them had voted, Obama probably would have picked up an additional 15,000 votes when you looked at who would have voted for Obama versus Romney. That we've got 23% of Floridians who can't vote because they are felons, and Florida has the most restrictive felon voting policy, restricting felons from voting. Florida voters have the longest average wait of any state in the United States. The average wait in 2012 was 40 minutes. In Vermont, it's 2 minutes. So we've got a mess. Florida has really put the duh in Florida. It's got to change. We've got to improve things. It's a mess.
Wendy, you know, I guess it boils down to, should there be a statewide standard for voting? Should every county have the same rules, or should it be up to each county election supervisor, as this bill is doing, to say, look, within these boundaries, you as a county election supervisor you have some discretion?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not going to come down on one side or another, but there is an equal protection kind of argument if voters in one county have many more hours of voting available to them than voters in another. On the other hand, you might also argue that a rural, thinly populated county is very different from a heavily urbanized county and what their voting needs are. I think Professor Paulson's right. This bill solves a lot of the problems that were caused by the 2011 reform law, but at least according to the Democrats, it doesn't go far enough, and there are some problems in the fine print. And one of them is that the early voting times are optional rather than mandatory, which means some supervisors may not do them. I think you're seeing some legislators who are very frustrated here because they blame the problems not on the law they passed in 2011, but on the election supervisors. And they've thrown a little amendment in here to allow the Secretary of State to dock the pay of a supervisor who doesn't act the way they want him to.
Well, before we go, we ask our panel members to tell us about one more major story from the past week. Wendy, your other big story.
Well, I've got to go back to Marco Rubio. The other thing he did this week, besides immigration was vote against the Toomey Manchin compromise on gun control, and I think in the long run that could cause him a bigger problem than this immigration bill did. March 21st Quinnipiac poll, by margins of high 50s to mid to low 40s, Floridians supported the tenets of the bill that he voted against and threatened to veto, and which then failed.
All right, Chris, your other big story.
Yeah, Hillsborough County Commissioner Les Miller is constantly trying to change the makeup of the county commission, either by through administrative things like how we select the chairman of the commission, or by how the commissioners are actually elected vis-a-vis their districts, and whether they're at-large or representative of a certain district area. And he was doing the latter here again recently, and he just gave up on that again, and hopefully Les has gotten the message that he needs to quit tinkering with the commission makeup.
All right, Barry, your other big story.
My big story is, if you look at the Florida House in Tallahassee, the Democratic caucus is showing that it finally wants to be a majority party under their new leader-elect, Darrell Rosato, who's my friend and client. But this week we saw several members of the caucus vote on the pro-gun side of some issues, on the pro-business side and some of the retail federation issues. And so you're seeing a broader constituencies that they're appealing to, that position them to eventually take back the majority.
And Darrell, your other big story?
Mine relates to a piece in the New York Times that's received very little coverage in the Florida papers, and it was about an article called "Curious Grade for Teachers, Nearly All Pass." And it talked about Leon County schools where 100% of the teachers were rated highly effective or effective. And in Alachua County, the first round, 78% of their teachers were rated highly effective, and when they compared that then to surrounding counties and found how poorly their teachers were doing compared to the other counties, they lowered the passing mark so that 99.4% of their teachers then were rated as highly effective or effective. So we have far exceeded Lake Wobegon, where Florida teachers are now very excellent. So if you think Florida schools are improving, forget it when you look at the evaluation process for teachers in the state of Florida. It's a mess.
Darrell, thank you. Barry, thank you. Chris, thank you. Wendy, thank you. And thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can record a comment on our toll-free line. It's 1-800-335-9338, or write us at ftw@wedu.org. And you can watch this show online on the wedu.org website beginning Monday morning. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.